You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. On this edition, we'll hear from local veterans reflecting on the dire situation unfolding in Afghanistan, where thousands are still trying to flee as the U.S. military withdraws.
We're not just talking about a death of people at the hands of the Taliban. We are talking about death as a result of bureaucracy. That we have a real-time humanitarian crisis that we actively had a hand in. Our response to it is to have this intensely slow bureaucratic process for even the people that actively collaborated with us. Like, all of my interpreters were killed. There's nothing I can do for my interpreters. And the United States government is making it in such a way to where there's nothing I could do for any other Afghan civilian, even if they didn't collaborate.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. After the Taliban took over the Afghan government, it had toppled major cities in a matter of days, a massive evacuation effort began. The U.S. is aiming to completely withdraw from Afghanistan by August 31st, President Biden has said. We recently talked to someone who had worked with the U.S. military in Afghanistan and was able to move to California on a special immigrant visa in 2014. He's now working hard to help others flee Afghanistan, including some members of his own family, and supporting refugees arriving here. Find that episode in our podcast feed or at sfpublicpress.org. Today, you'll hear from U.S. military veterans, many of whom across the country have been deeply affected by what's happening in Afghanistan. We talked about the parallels that they see between the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam and its withdrawal from Afghanistan, the lasting effects of 2 decades of military engagement, and above all, the concern they have for the condition of Afghans.
So my name is Michael Blecker. I'm the Executive Director of Swords to Plowshares in San Francisco with an office in Oakland as well. And we provide services and care for veterans since 1974. I've been with the agency since 1976.
And I am Tyler Solorio. I am a policy analyst at Swords to Plowshares. For my military background, I'm an Army veteran. I did a deployment to Afghanistan back in 2011.
Great. Thank you both for making the time to be here. I really appreciate it. I want to start by talking about the effect that this is having on veterans. As the Department of Veterans Affairs put it recently, the news about Afghanistan can trigger a complicated wave of emotions. Michael, maybe you could start us off by telling us what Swords to Plowshares has been hearing from veterans since news started coming out of Afghanistan that the Taliban was rapidly taking over major cities.
It's been, a lot of disturbing images and the humanitarian crisis, and everything's happened so quickly, right? Where the war or the military, Afghanistan military everything just took over, the Taliban took over so quickly. And so folks are just, like veterans, like other folks, are trying to come to grips with it. In our own sense of the staff and the community, I haven't heard too much, but, we have benefited from the VA putting out a lot of kind of resources about how vets can talk to one another. So there's a Veterans Crisis Line, there's a Vet Center, there's a number of groups that have really made it a point to sort of work with each other as on the support level, a VA caregiver support line and a rally point, et cetera. Among ourselves, the veterans that we serve, they tend to be in pretty dire straits, very struggling to stay off the streets. In our housing program, they come to us because they have specific issues, be it their VA claim, be it trying to get work, be it trying to stay off the streets, be it trying to get medical care. So they're in a state of crisis, and they seek us to assist them. So I've heard less from our direct client base, and maybe Tyler's heard more, but more about what the community itself is trying to do. And a lot of this is peer-to-peer stuff. Oddly enough, I just recently got something from the VA where they're trying to assist Afghanis who veterans may know or may be sponsoring because they're in this country, and help them secure a visa situation, a special visa that's now being available, which I find pretty fascinating. It's sort of a new day here with trying to address the terrible state of events. And I say that because every war produces refugees. Every war produces massive dislocation, massive suffering. It's not just when one side or another declares it's over. We know how war continues and how the true cost of war continues. And so we know the suffering will reach a different level and will continue. I think everyone's right now is trying to concern with that. How can we shape that?
Yes, and that sounds like it's a particularly daunting task, and like that continuation will be going on for a long time because this conflict has been going on so long already. I mean, 20 years of U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Does that do you think extend the tail of effects, the long lasting after effects of war as you've just described them?
I don't see how it
Yeah.
cannot but, right? It's just basic math. I mean, the trauma that's caused by this kind of suffering magnifies itself the longer folks are under that same pressure and the same stress.
Hmm.
It's not just a spectacle. The spectacle ends, but the suffering will continue long after the spectacle ends. We know that. I'm very fearful of children and the after effects they will have, and just the sheer suffering and the dislocation that that causes, and being a refugee and what that means. So that's my fear.
Yeah. So, Tyler, you actually did serve in Afghanistan. What has been going through your mind as these events have unfolded? Can you maybe walk us through how you've been seeing this unfold and what your thoughts have been?
So, an issue that I have with kind of how, at least I feel like it's been being portrayed or being discussed about, is I'm not sure exactly what people thought that the outcomes would be. And I feel like this has left kind of the collective mindset of most Americans. But the Taliban had offered a term of surrender within months of this initially starting. And the United States government refused that term of surrender. And then considering that we have been there basically, for so many decades since, I really don't know what the outcome would have been of, okay, how many more decades would the US military have been in there, right? How much longer would have the occupation gone on from there? And then in turn of also the government, I think there was just kind of like a level of having been to Afghanistan and having worked closely with government officials, there was always this constant question, I think, for anybody who was in the military who did have a lot of experience working with government officials was, okay, how many of them work for who?
Hmm.
And so in a lot of ways, when the news happened, it wasn't necessarily a surprise because I feel like anybody with kind of insight into the situation is like, this wasn't going to transition into a stable situation. This wasn't going to transition into a situation where the Afghan government was secured in its establishment or anything like that. The part that catches people off guard the most is kind of just how quickly basically it collapsed.
Yep.
And I think that's a real shock factor. And the VA does reference onto talking about the complexity of emotions. And I think that's kind of dead on the point because there are a variety of people who have a variety of different feelings. Like some people may characterize this as feeling like, oh, we lost a war. But then on the flip side, there are those of us who are also looking at it and being like, okay, well, one, it didn't feel like a war, it felt like an occupation. And, what did we lose exactly? Like, we offered them a surrender at the beginning. They offered us a surrender at the beginning. We did not accept that. And I don't know, for me personally, characterizing it as a loss or for others characterizing it as a loss, it feels kind of weird because the only thing that I'm thinking of right now is just kind of seeing the suffering of Afghans as it's happening in real time. And then a lot of centering too on specifically aiding Afghans who only helped out the US when it's just like this is a bigger humanitarian issue than that. And, like there's a ton of people who reasonably did not help out the US because it would endanger their lives. And to me, it also poses the question like, are they also not worthy of refugee status? Are they also not worthy of protections? Like, we need to really extend it for a lot further and a lot more forward.
Yeah. It sounds like you have been anticipating the worst for a long time. but that it was a shock nonetheless to a lot of people that this happened so quickly. Can you talk about your initial reactions as the Taliban started taking over cities, and that this happened in a matter of days, and the news was just coming in like every day? Their advances were faster and farther than had been anticipated.
Yeah, I think because I mean, back in 2011, it felt like a lot of us were already forgotten.
Mm.
It felt like the occupation itself was forgotten. I remember literally going on leave and then telling a person that I was coming back from Afghanistan and hearing, "Oh, we're still there," and this was a decade ago.
Wow.
And yeah, exactly. And so, but I feel like the people who had that intimacy, because I did have a degree of intimacy with dealing with Afghan police, with Afghan military, and there was no level of government entity that you felt like you could actually trust, and that maybe in some way they weren't working with. In our case, my area of operations didn't deal with the Taliban. We dealt with the Haqqani network, and but every single level of government a decade ago felt compromised. Like, okay, can we actually trust working with them? Do we know if they will or will not shoot us in the back? Like, I didn't think that had fundamentally changed over the past decade for a variety of reasons. And so just kind of seeing it in real time, it was more just like, oh, so this is kind of the consequence of that, of just lacking that understanding, of lacking that grasp. Because I don't think at a higher up, at a significant higher up, talking intelligence services, stuff like that, like I think they definitely had a better understanding of this than, lower enlisted, absolute kind of grunts that are just like out there working on it with no real top down view of it. But it just kind of like underscored the point of how little control we actually have ever presumed that we had as a military occupation.
Sorry, Michael, did you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted, and there's so many similarities to Vietnam in many respects, but this whole nature of the of how little we really understood about the language, the culture, the just the whole, sociology, the whole life and the generations that went before us, and it's just phenomenal. Just the lack of awareness and understanding of what we were up against. We had no idea. I mean, that's how I experienced when I was in Vietnam as an infantryman. There's a recent collection. I think it's called the Afghanistan Papers, and it was where some of the war policymakers, Pentagon, et cetera, who also were pretty clueless about who was a bad guy, supposedly, as if they were a bad person, right? And just what they didn't have any idea of what all this meant. The fabric of that society was so unknown. And it reminded me of the war in Vietnam, so many respects. And I was in that war, and then 8 years later, the war's still going on. It was only 10 years, but it was that same effect that you came back, and you came back to a society that was less and less involved, or even understood what was going on, or had already, quote, turned the channel about the Vietnam War. It was already kind of over. But here, clearly, you had such a small percentage who wore the uniform, whose families were involved, who truly turned the channel, or went to another, on and streamed something more from the internet. I mean, it disappeared from their consciousness for over a decade here.
I'm glad you brought up that comparison, because I wanted to go in that direction myself. There's already been a lot of comparisons drawn to, the evacuation effort from Vietnam and now from Afghanistan. I'm glad that you're talking about those parallels, and I wanted to see if you had any thoughts about how that should shape our understanding or consideration of these events. What should we be thinking about if we see history sort of repeating itself or echoing Vietnam? Are there considerations that we should have in mind that we didn't after Vietnam collectively?
Where there was a very powerful guest essay in the New York Times a little while ago by an author who wrote a wonderful book called The Sympathizer, Nguyen Viet Thanh Nguyen. And he just wrote about the whole thing about how the whole idea about war is tragedy and farce. But I think the point he was making was It was a difference. In Vietnam, they evacuated, 130,000 Vietnamese people and accepted literally hundreds of thousands more. And of course, one can see it today in the Southeast Asian American communities who are flourishing in many respects. But that was only made possible because, the after effects of the war that allowed so many people to come back in to the country. So that whole idea, that moral imperative should exist, must exist today to alleviate some of the suffering that the Afghan people will face. So in that sense, that analogy, that would be helpful for that to replicate itself and not compound the failure. You know what I mean? But keep our country borders open, allow a new community to flourish in the States.
Hmm. Tyler, did you want to add to that? Because this sounds like this dovetails with what you were talking about earlier, that there seems to be this focus on people who assisted the U.S. military in Afghanistan, but less of a focus on, responsibility to Afghans in general.
So I think both touching on what was talked about prior about comparing Vietnam and Afghanistan is like, yeah, there are similarities, but it's so far from one to one for a variety of factors. And like we could spend easily days talking about how they are not the same in a lot of ways. And then specifically talking about kind of in the refugee context, I can't speak to necessarily what it looked like for refugees in the wake of post Vietnam. But more broadly speaking, talking about refugees from more generally, I think what's important here is that, and especially in the context of the United States, is that we have this standard where there is this impending doom, right? That there's real time deaths happening. And our response to it is to create this overly bureaucratic system of accepting people who are in danger right now and with intense repercussions for those people. We're talking death of family members, all as many horrible things as we can think of. That's what we're discussing. And this has been a historical reality of the United States forever. I think immediately, to obvious, like bigger examples of the times that we turned away refugees during World War II. And so just thinking of it right now, like, we're not just talking about a death of people at the hands of the Taliban and anybody who is associated with them. We are talking about death as a result of bureaucracy, that we have a real-time humanitarian crisis that we actively had a hand in, that we actively shaped, that we actively inflamed, made worse, and just really created this kindling for and also fire over the past 20 years. Our response to it is to have this intensely slow bureaucratic process, not even broadly just for Afghans generally, but for even the people that actively collaborated with us. And coming from a personal end, like all of my interpreters were killed. There's nothing I can do for my interpreters. And the United States government is making it in such a way to where there's nothing I could do for any other Afghan civilian, even if they didn't collaborate. And so my immediate pushback is that it's more important that we bypass this whole bureaucratic entanglement and all this other stuff that is actively, willfully set up by the U.S. government, and that we need to unconditionally start accepting any refugees as a result of this.
Wow. I was going to ask you about efforts that veterans are coordinating across the U.S. to try and get people to the airport, get people out who worked with them in Afghanistan. And I just recently spoke with someone who himself worked with the U.S. military in Afghanistan, arrived in the U.S. in 2014, and just has been trying to move heaven and earth to help other people, including some of his own family members, to get out. And one of the things he said is that an important way that people can help is to try and reach out to the folks that they worked with, their former subordinates, because often, visa applications require this letter from a supervisor confirming that they assisted the U.S. or other foreign agencies. And I wanted to ask you, it sounds like for yourself that is not something that is open to you, but do you know of such efforts happening in the Bay Area?
So, right now, what I would recommend is for veterans who are interested in helping Afghans. Recently, I've heard of an organization, I think they're a newer organization, the United Afghan Association. So, that kind of to preface this, is the Bay Area is, I'm pretty confident, the largest community of Afghans in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so this organization, they're specifically working around this issue, and they're trying to rally around it. So I know they have a rally, for example, at United Nations Plaza in San Francisco this coming Saturday at 2 p.m. I know they're also connecting people to resources. They're trying to help advocate and provide resources. I think it's also an opportunity to center their voices. And as veterans, we are already held in a limelight by default, just in the way that American culture works. And our job needs to be putting the limelight on Afghans talking about this, and Afghans trying to connect resources. And so I think at a community level, supporting organizations like this are intensely important. But then also, once you're connected through them in terms of, like, I know they have social media, being able to go from that social media, and I know they're providing resources for like attorneys within the Bay Area that are also directly trying to work on this. So like material responses of having actual legal assistance in this regards. And then just kind of, if there's opportunity to sign up, I know that they do make requests of veterans and trying to pull in. There's also groups like About Face who do coordinate different veterans on a lot of different issues. And I know that organization is also coordinating veterans on this, and they do function more of as like a support role of, hey, we want to aid this community. What's the best way that we can channel veterans into aiding this community?
I'm speaking with Tyler Solorio and Michael Blecker from Swords to Plowshares, a nonprofit that supports veterans in the Bay Area. Michael, I wanted to ask you about what resources are available to veterans who might find themselves affected by this, might find their mental health impacted by this, who might just be looking to connect with others. What is available if anyone, is looking for help?
Like I said, there's resources that have gone out through the VA, and Tyler might be able to update some of this, but there's a veterans crisis line that allow vets to share with each other. And there's a chat line, there's quote online information, the Vet Center movement, which allows vets to, talk to other vets about this. There's a number of organizations. I think there's the VA Caregiver Support Line, Together We Serve. Student vets have access to Student Vets of America, Team Rubicon. I was going to ask Tyler, do you have any thoughts, Tyler, on what the current situation with resources for vets are, or is there some priorities you would recommend?
So I haven't heard of any specialized resources. It's pre-existing resources that the VA has already used for, in terms of mental health and community building with veterans. I do want to pitch, because Michael had sent me this information beforehand on certain things. Like the State Department does have an information website regarding two visas for Afghans who have worked with the U.S. government. So like there are resources out there that actually go into detail about how these different things work, that people can pick up and try and use. So like if you are a veteran and you do have connections still with Afghans who are still on the ground, who may have worked in some capacity, there are ways that you as an individual might be able to share resources or try and get them connected. Because the thing is, like, a lot of us also, before, like, so for example, when my interpreters were killed, they were killed after I left. I was still connected with them on social media when I had left. And so I know what might be the case for me isn't the case for others, and they still might be maintaining those relationships and communications with Afghans abroad. And it's a dangerous time. It's also a dangerous time to be talking. But at the
Right.
same time, if there's a way that you can establish those communications and try and connect those resources as well, I think that's important, because we have those personal relationships too.
Yeah, absolutely. If you could speak just to others, let's say you have the ear of other people who did serve in Afghanistan, is there something you would say to them directly right now about the situation?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a lot of the people I know who had served with me in some capacity, that in a lot of ways we kind of felt weird about what we were doing. We felt something was off, or like we didn't understand what was going on. And I kind of want to put it out there that, like, we have an obligation to these people. We have an obligation to everyday civilians. We have an obligation to everybody. Like, we know, and I feel like particularly too, like if you were embedded and you were dealing with Afghan civilians every day, like the average civilian was just out living their life, like doing their thing. And to me, just thinking about all of the kind people that I had ever met who had every reason to be mean to me, to not want to associate with me, to be cruel towards me, to treat me however they rightfully felt, I just kind of see their faces and I think of the moral obligation that we have and the moral failings of not only necessarily kind of participating in this thing that should not have happened, but also at the same time, the moral failings of not following through, of not trying to be there for these people, and of not trying to take care of these people in a way that's actually beneficial, by accepting whoever needs to be accepted and by bringing them in and taking care of them. And so, as veterans, we are held in this unique limelight where oftentimes we're given like this special identity that for some reason we're better than a lot of other people, which is a bit ridiculous. But at the same time, like, we may as well weaponize that identity to actually help people. And I think this is one of those moments where we need to be there for these people.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. I think this will be out of the news cycle soon. There are other events will overtake this crisis in Afghanistan, and I think it's really crucial that veterans speak up and remind folks of this moral obligation. Because if vets don't do it, I'm not sure who's going to step up to do it. Right? They have an important role to, not the only group, but they have an important role to play, I think, and it has a lot of credibility with our fellow countrymen to keep that moral obligation front and center, even after the news cycle ends, and this is no longer on the front page.
Yeah. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add that I didn't specifically give you a chance to talk about?
Well, there's so many things one could talk about, right?
Yeah.
The similarities, the differences, what it means to have a war and the after effects of war, and there's so much, right? All we know is that at Swords, we've been doing this work since 1974. I've been here since 76, and we still have issues of poverty, homelessness, suffering, stress from those who fought wars going back to World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and all the forever wars that have since come. And the cost of war doesn't end. And people, for whatever, we're never reminded of that by the policymakers.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have anything else to add, but I appreciate y'all for your time.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Michael Blecker, Executive Director, and Tyler Solorio, a policy analyst from Swords to Plowshares. You can learn more about their organization's services at swords-to-plowshares.org. The number for the Veterans Crisis Line that Michael mentioned is 1-800-273-8255. The Crisis Line also has a chat function at veteranscrisisline.net or a texting option you can reach by sending a message to 838-255. There are also vet centers, community-based counseling centers that offer the opportunity for veterans to discuss their feelings with peers. The VA recommends finding nearby centers by calling 1-877-927-8387. I'm Laura Wennis, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic is turning 2 years old. We're going to celebrate by spending some time strategizing and planning for the future. It also means that your feedback could not come at a more impactful time. So if you have a couple minutes to tell us what you think about the show, we have a survey for you. Find it at surveymonkey.com/R/civic listeners. So let us know what you think. And thanks so much for listening.